New episode, Aeolus. Oftentimes, the chapters that you find most challenging will become your favorites, and I think this is the case with Aeolus. Joyce has thoroughly decided to play games with the reader and his text by this point. This chapter is fun, it's challenging, it's confusing, and I will try to help you make your way into it. I certainly didn't appreciate this chapter at first, and I even found it a little dull the first time I read it, I remember. It's not that the overall action of this chapter is that complicated. It's in a newspaper office, Bloom visits the office, Stephen visits the office, people come and go. It's not that. It's that the way that it's written and the number of names that Joyce throws in this chapter are very confusing. Now, Stephen is in the offices of these newspaper men because he is bringing that letter, you remember, that Mr. DC gave him in Nestor. And he also just kind of likes the atmosphere, I think, of being around these other writers, even though they're much more utilitarian writers. The art of this chapter, Rhetoric, is a different type of writing than the poetics that attract him. Bloom is there because he regularly works with these newspapers to contract advertising space. He goes around and talks to store owners and so on, saying, hey, would you like to do a contract with the newspapers to have some advertising? And they'll say yes or no, and he gets a cut of that somehow, I think. It doesn't seem like he has an office, certainly not at the offices of these newspaper people. He just is there to try and secure this deal. When Joyce first published this chapter in the little review, he did not have these newspaper headlines at the top of every few paragraphs, as you see. When it was going into the proof stage of Ulysses, the entire book was finished, he added all these titles, and maybe they're to help the reader, but I don't know if they really help, because some of them may even confuse a little. They're more just to impart the feel of a newspaper, that these people working around the news constantly, they frame the world in this way by putting these simple headlines, simple causation, and really going for the most sensational aspect of every story. Because of the heavy nature of the media in this chapter, I think this entire chapter could have been the start of Marshall McLuhan's career. The fact that the way that these people work in this newspaper office, it makes their reality. It creates their feeling of how the world is. What about the Odyssey, though? There's no newspapers back in the olden times of the Odyssey. True, and that is because the art Rhetoric is something that existed before newspapers, and something that has existed for a long, long time. There were people in ancient Greece specifically considered masters of rhetoric, that they could put words into such pretty packages that they would sway the course of people's beliefs, whether they were telling the truth or not. That didn't matter. Joyce, he understands rhetoric, but I think he's also very cynical about it, and cynical about the nature of journalism. So even though Stephen Dedalus in this chapter almost gets offered a job to work as a writer on the newspaper, it's clear that he, by refusing this, he's going towards a more poetic path. So Odysseus is, floating on the ocean with his crew and his ship, trying to get back to Ithaca, but there's all these winds, so they stop at this isle of this guy named Aeolus. And Aeolus lives on an island called Aeolia. I don't know if he's named after the island or the island's named after him, but they're both, maybe it's like Disneyland, they kind of named each other. Aeolus understands, and he's kind of a mini-god like Circe and some other mini-gods that we've seen, who is, he's a master of the winds. He could control all these directions of the winds. And he would like be possessed of them. He kept them in a bag or something. And when Odysseus was trying to get back to Ithaca, heading west, so he said, you know what I'm going to do, Odysseus guy, because you're a cool guy, I'm going to take all the winds, the east wind, the north wind, the south wind, and put them in this bag. So you'll just have the wind blowing you to the west. And you can have this bag of wind, And if you just like keep those in there, you'll be fine and you'll just blow straight west and get home in no time at all. So Odysseus is like, cool, I'm going to do that. So he goes, he says, guys, we're leaving this island. We're heading home. He gets in the ship. He gets at the, what's that called? The oar? The steering thing. Not the steering wheel, the wheel. I'll just call it the wheel. He's at the wheel and he says, we're going straight to Ithaca. I'm not going to sleep until we get to home. And they I don't know how long it takes, maybe a week or two. He's just like, I'm really tired, but I'm going to make it home to Ithaca. And he can see the island. They're that close. I don't know if they could see the whites of their eyes, as that expression goes, but he could see the island itself. And he's like, cool, but I'm so tired. He passes out. And his men, his crew, they're like, oh, we're almost home, but you know what? I think I've seen this bag that Odysseus has. It's probably treasure. Why don't we open the bag and see what treasure he has? So Odysseus is passed out. They open the bag and all the winds come out, the south wind, the north wind, the east wind, and they just get blown all the way back to Aeolia, the Isle of Aeolus. And Odysseus wakes up at some point, presumably. When they get to the island of Aeolus, he probably looked at them with disgust and said, like, you know what? I give you this gift and try to help you get home, and you abuse it. Clearly, Odysseus, you are a man hated by the gods, and you're cursed somehow, so just get off my island. And Odysseus and his men leave. Who in this chapter is this wind god? That's the editor of the newspaper, this guy named Miles Crawford. He's actually, even though it's only about noon or 1, Miles Crawford is already drunk at this point in the day, and that is going to add to his temper, his attitude, his just the windiness of this whole situation. But the wind is not just this person particularly, it's this entire industry and media bias and slanted narratives and the nature of rhetoric. The first sentence or the first headline of this chapter refers to being in the heart of the Hibernian metropolis. Hibernian is just an old-timey word for Irish. You can see the etymology here. But it refers to a heart, so you might think this organ of this chapter is the heart, but it's actually the lungs. I was thinking about why that might be. Why would Joyce refer to the heart, there being in the heart? Actually, let's take a look at where this happens. This is the section of town that this takes place. This is probably the most touristy area of Dublin nowadays. And even though it's the heart of the city, the heart needs oxygen, and what provides the oxygen is the lungs that bring in the oxygen from the air into our heart and bloodstream and removing carbon dioxide. So this circulation is what is the press. That's what they represent in this chapter. And just as the lungs provide the oxygen, the press provides something that creates this motion in the city amongst people, amongst information tiers. Before media studies, rhetoric was probably the closest thing that we had to media studies, because they are both concerned with the effect of the communication, not just the content, the things that go on in different media. So this chapter is fascinating, that Joyce takes this old book about rhetoric and he includes as many of the devices as possible. We'll look at that maybe a little more with the annotations, but there's like entire pages referring just to the rhetoric techniques in this chapter, of which there are many, many, many. Like Hades, this chapter can be divided into 2 sections. The first focusing on Bloom, trying to get that contract for the advertiser, and the second featuring more on Stephen and this story that he tells, this parable, and we'll look at what it all means. Do Stephen and Bloom meet in this episode? Not really. They cross paths, as we'll see. And Joyce is clearly having fun having them nearly meet several times in the day.